So Konami are making a Suikoden 2 anime, and we know that they're not going to be able to give a good amount of screen time to every single one of the 108 stars and fully integrate all of them into the story. We know that, don't we? We know that. So the question becomes, who gets a chunk of an episode dedicated to them? Who gets relegated to nothing more than a cameo? Who gets cut entirely? Same applies to elements of the story. Do we want to include every single story beat, or can we streamline it a bit? In this series, I'm going to be storyboarding episode by episode what I think the full anime series should look like. In this video, I'm going to be covering what I think should be in episodes 4, 5, and 6. Episodes 1, 2, and 3 were in the previous video. I'll put a link in the corner in case you missed it. So, episode 4. We left off last time with Victor and Flick having rescued Ryu and Joey and Nanami from Highland, and they're now all back at the fort. The gang are more guests at the fort now rather than prisoners, and they're kind of free to go and do whatever they want, because, like, what are they going to do? Escape back to Highland again? So one way or another, they need to end up going to Toto village. And I don't think we need to, like, invent a hard plot reason for them to go there. I think it's fine either for Nanami to just say that now they've got some kind of downtime or some freedom to wander about, she'd like to go and explore the local towns. Or even for Joey to say there's a family who pulled him out of the river and nursed him back to health that live in Toto and he'd like to go and visit them. I think either of those is fine. I think it's fine for the story to have a bit of an exhale after the last 3 episodes. So they end up in Toto and we get an introduction to Pilika. Now I feel like there's not a lot of love for Pilika. I think people find her a bit annoying, which I guess I understand. But she is an important character and we definitely need to keep her. She's very symbolic of a lot of what is lost in war. You know, a child is a pretty classic symbol of innocence. She also gets used as a bit of a playing piece between Ryu and Joey later, so it is important that we keep her. So we meet Pilika, we get an introduction to her family. Now in the game, Nanami isn't really involved in this scene because you actually don't need to bring her. You don't even need to rescue her from Highland. You can just run away with Victor and Flick and just leave her there, which is what we do in the speedrun. But obviously we should rescue Nanami and she should be with Ryu and Joey at this point. We meet Pilika's parents. We learn that Pilika's father is charged with the upkeep of a shrine, which will obviously become important in later episodes. And we get the scene where Pilika gives the gang some money she's saved up and asks them to go and buy a nice looking amulet that she saw in an item shop in Muse because she wants to give it to her father as a birthday present. So they accept, they leave Toto, and they head off to the big city. Now at this point, I think we should have a bit of a cutaway to Luca on his warpath, because the viewer hasn't actually seen Luca Blight since the prologue. And in the game, we have when they return to Toto village, Toto has been burned, and that's a kind of reminder that Luca Blight's a horrible bastard. In the game, they return to Toto and find it burned to the ground, and that's the kind of reminder of who Luca is. And then they get the second scene where Luca is burning Ryubi village after the fetch quest to go and get Sai so he can restore the fire spears or whatever. I'm going to make some changes there, but I'll come back to that in a minute. So we get a scene with Luca talking to his generals about the strategy for them taking territory. We make it clear that he is a big threat to the locations that our heroes are in, and that they are not safe. We need to remind the viewer that the gang aren't simply having a nice fun time. There is this big threat still looming. So they go to Muse, and I think we can have a bit of an introduction to Muse here. Muse is like the biggest city that they've probably ever been to. It's the capital of the city-states. And we can have some brief introductions, not with dialogue, I don't think, but some brief flashes of some characters that will become important later, like Annabelle. Maybe they can go up and see the town hall, and we can see Annabelle walking through the front doors surrounded by diplomats or something, or they could see her in a meeting through a window if they would be able to see that from the street. Maybe not, I don't know. Maybe we get a glimpse of like Jess or Horza again moving through the town surrounded by important looking people. The viewer isn't going to know who these people are yet, but, well, people who play the game will, but we'll get a little kind of nod that this is an important place and there are some important people here. So after that, we get the characters being kind of awed by this big city a little bit. They find the item shop, they speak to the owner, and he says, this amulet, you can have it, but it's worth a lot more money than that. So then you get this scene where in the game, the player has to decide whether they want to pay for the amulet themselves, which in the game you can do because you have money in the game because monsters drop money. But in this anime series, it's hard to think why the gang would have any of their own money. Do Victor and Flick give them like a stipend or a living wage? I wouldn't think so. And it would be a bit of a weird thing for these people who've been prisoners and just escaped death in a prisoner of war camp and are now being allowed to stay at a mercenary fort as a kind of the only place where they can stay, to get a bunch of money out of their pockets to be like, all right, we'll pay for it. Where would they get it from? And so in the game, if you refuse to pay, Joey then takes off his family signet ring and sells it, and you get the amulet that way. And I think that would be a really nice thing to have happen. It shows Joey's separation from his family. He's been cast out by his family, and this is him, severing the last ties with them. And it demonstrates his commitment to Pilika and her family and like what it means to him and what it means to the group. So they get the amulet, they leave Muse and make their way back to Toto. And then, as we know in the game, they get back to Toto and find it completely burnt to the ground, everyone's slaughtered, and it looks like they've generally had a really bad time while they've been gone. Now, this is where I think I want to make a change, because in the game, the Highland Army have already left by the time you get back to Toto. And then you go back to the fort, you get sent on a fetch quest to go and get Sai, and then as you're making your way back from Ryobi Forest with Sai, you reach Ryobi Town and you find the Highland Army there. That's where you have the big scene with Luca being a mad, crazy, evil, horrible bastard. And you get the die pig die scene and all of that. Now, that's obviously a very important scene and we don't want to lose that. But I don't think we should have that fetch quest with Sai. And it will pretty much mean having an episode, or at least a good chunk of an episode, dedicated to that fetch quest. We're either then adding another full episode into the timeline of the series just for that, when we could quite easily have that Luca scene in Toto, or we're making it part of an episode, we're making it the first half of an episode where that significant scene happens halfway through, and then we're going back to the fort and starting all the big warfight stuff halfway through an episode, and all of that just feels wrong. The viewer will also have a little more investment in Toto Village than they would in Ryobi. Ryobi's just kind of, we don't know anyone in Ryobi. We know Pilika and her family in Toto though, and we can see it getting burned before our eyes. So for all those reasons, I think we have the scene with Luca and company in Toto, and we get the die pig die scene, and that could maybe even happen with like Pilika's mum or something, but that might be a little heavy-handed. I'm not sure how I feel about that. I think it works just fine with a random NPC. Either way, all the gang can do is find a spot to hide and watch and wait for the army to leave. Then once they have, they make their way into the town to start looking for survivors. As we know, they find Pilika, who was able to take refuge in her father's shrine. There's the big emotional reunion. Pilika's telling them about how awful it was, and then Apple arrives as the kind of end of episode mysterious stranger, providing a bit of a hook for what's to come in the next episode. And I think that's fine. I think most of the time when you introduce a new character, you probably want it to be at the beginning of an episode, to be like, this is the character that this episode's going to be focused around, or this episode's going to be about learning who this character is, or, learning about this character and what they do in the world, or whatever. But I think a good way to introduce a character is also like this, have them come in at the end of an episode and be a bit of a mysterious entity, like to drive the viewer into the next episode. And that's kind of what Apple will do here. She says, do you know a mercenary fort run by people called Victor and Flick? I'm looking for them. I need to get to them because I need to talk to them about what the hell's happening. And they say, yeah, we know them. Okay, great. Drag the crying child if you have to. We need to go. And that's the end of episode 4. Now, something you might have noticed that was missing from that episode is any fighting. There was some killing with Luca's soldiers, I guess, but there wasn't exactly any combat sequences. And that's actually the first episode, I think, where there would be no fighting at all, which I'm going to try not to do too many episodes like that, because I do think fighting is going to be an important part of this. They're fighting a war, after all. And this was one of the things I kind of forgot to mention about the last episode, how important the combat elements are. And there are 2 elements of the combat that I wanted to kind of touch on and make sure that we're keeping. First one is unite attacks. I think unite attacks will translate really well into the anime. I think anime is a really good medium for cool combat sequences in general. Combat sequences that are really kind of hyper stylized are obviously a very anime thing, and unites play into that really well. We'll have Ryu and Joey doing the buddy attack on the soldiers as they escape over the cliff. Ryu and Nanami can do their family attack when Raold's soldiers come to take them from their home in Kiaro. When they're fighting the mist monster in an earlier episode, the circus gang can ask Ryu and Joey to hold the mist monster off while they get in formation, and then they burst forward and do their big circus attack with Bolgan's big fire breath. So I think unite attacks are going to be a really cool addition to combat sequences and make them really interesting depending on which characters are involved. The second thing is, of course, runes. Runes are a huge part of the story, and they will need to be in the game, obviously. In an upcoming episode, we'll have Ryu and Joey getting the Bright Shield and Black Sword runes, which are the 2 big plot drivers of the whole story, and that can't be the first mention of runes that we've had. So Rina has a fire rune. We can see a bit of Flick's lightning rune when he and Victor rescue the guys from the Highland prison, and we'll need to have had a few mentions of runes here and there so the viewer knows that those are the source of magic in this world. That said, we move on to episode 5. And the reason I wanted to say that bit about combat before episode 5 is because episode 5 is going to be very combat heavy. This is essentially going to be big war fight sequences. As I mentioned, I think we cut the fetch quest to go and get Sai. I think we still want to keep the fire spears. They can just note that they're a bit rusty and they'll have to work hard to get them battle ready. So we'll have a reunion with Apple, Victor, and Flick. There can be a few nods to the fact that they've fought a war together before. And Ryu and Joey obviously say they want to fight alongside them. Then this episode's going to be a lot of exciting war fights. We'll have one big sequence where the good guys are able to hold the Highland army off. Apple says that if we can just hold out for a couple of days, she's got reinforcements on their way from Muse, and they managed to do that. They managed to hold them off, and that feels like a victory. But then if you remember the game, we have a messenger, a scout, run back to the fort and say, the Highland army are advancing again. And then in that second combat, things are a lot darker, things are a lot less, yeah, we're gonna win. And Highland, of course, take the fort. So there are soldiers everywhere. Ryu and Joey come back from the battlefield. They're pushed back to the fort, and they realize Pilika's in there. We need to rescue her. They also know that Luca Blight is around somewhere. He's in evidence. He's in the fort somewhere. So then, of course, they run into the fort up to the top to find Luca Blight hovering over Pilika and Pol. Now, this is where the stuff we did with Pol in those earlier episodes is going to pay off, investing a little more in his character so the viewer feels that friendship and kinship with Pol as a character. In the game, he's kind of standing off to the side a little bit, and Luca just kind of kills him and then moves on to Pilika. But I think we know Pol as a kind of, not mentor exactly, but he's been put in charge of the main characters' kind of well-being while they were prisoners, and we know that he always wanted what's best for them. He looks out for them. So we know him in that way, and so I think we should have him standing protectively over Pilika while Luca is looming over them with his big horrible sword. And then of course Ryu and Joey come in time to see Pol cut down by Luca. And that moment will have all the more resonance because of the work we did with Pol's character in earlier episodes. It then comes down to Ryu and Joey, of course, to jump in front of Luca. And they know it's hopeless. They know they can't fight him off, but they do it anyway. And at the moment where Luca's about to cut them down, big old explosion. You know, bits of the ceiling fall through, the floor falls through, maybe Luca falls through a big hole in the floor or something. A little bit later, the dust settles. Well, a few seconds later, the dust settles. Victor and Flick come running in, say they've thrown a bunch of the fire spears into the boiler. Apparently there's a boiler. And pull Ryu and Joey and Pilika out, escape with them. Everyone kind of scatters and we hear flee to Muse. And that's the objective that we get left with. So that's where episode 5 ends. We then move on to episode 6, which begins out in the wild with all our heroes kind of scattered. We know, of course, they need to get to Muse, and the way we get there is through Toto. So they know it's going to be difficult. They've got Pilika with them, and they'd rather not bring her through the burned out remains of her village, but they have no choice. So they go. And as they move through Toto, Pilika brings them to the shrine that her father looked after, and this is where we get the sequence of Ryu and Joey getting their true runes. So we get an introduction to Lekna, who can be, I think, as she is in the game. I don't think we need any detailed explanation of who she is. The game doesn't really give that. I think her whole vibe is that she's a bit of a mysterious entity, and I think she can remain so in the show. And then they go to get the runes, and we get this whole flashback sequence of their lives up to that point and their relationship with each other. And this sequence is going to be a real opportunity for the medium of anime to really shine. Now, I'm not going to go through how every scene should look and be stylized. I'm not an animator, but I need to trust the animators to make something impactful and beautiful and just really wow the viewer with this flashback sequence before they get their runes. The viewer needs to feel that it's a significant moment, because it is. So we have that whole flashback sequence. Ryu and Joey get their runes. We get the sense that the runes are, you know, opposite faces of a coin in the way that they kind of are. Leknat then teleports them back to get reunited with just Nanami and Pilika, I guess, and then they continue making their way out of Toto and onto Muse. Now this is where in the game they arrive at Muse, are denied entry, and told that with the war situation as it is, anyone who wants to enter Muse needs a permit. And so they go to the White Deer Inn, they meet Alex and Hilda, and they do the whole Sindar ruins thing. Big dungeon in the game, fight a boss, leave Sindar ruins, and they got the whole lesson with the treasure is the healing herbs that then Alex is able to use to restore his wife who has become sick while he's away. Is that worth keeping in the show? Personally, I don't know what benefit it would be. I know there are a lot of fans of the game who really want to see Konami expand on the mystery of the Sindar, but I don't think that's what the anime is for. We've got Suikoden Starleap, the mobile game, coming out as well. Hopefully we'll get some expansion on some lore there, but I think the purpose of this anime is a tool to bring a new audience in, to hopefully create some new fans of the series. And if they want to expand on any of the existing lore, they have to put the time in to explain it up to the point where players of the game currently understand it, get the new viewers up to speed, and then expand on it from there. And that's going to be such a significant time investment. You know, I would love to see more about the feud between Yuba and Peshmerga. Characters like Killy, who is connected to the Sindar in some way. You know, we'd all like to see those things expanded on, but I just don't think that the anime is the right place to do that. I think this show is going to be for a retelling of the core story in a new medium to bring new fans to the series. So that being the case, we would need to kind of end the episode where they get denied entry to Muse, which is not really a very satisfying way to end the episode, because the Sindar Ruins, the White Deer in Sindar Ruins, really has to be its own whole episode. I don't think we can have them arriving in Toto, that whole flashback sequence, getting their runes, to then halfway through an episode arrive at the White Deer Inn and do the whole Sindar thing and have that. That feels like a really disjointed episode and not without a clear focus. So I think we cut the whole White Deer Inn Sindar thing completely. Come at me in the comments if you want, but that's what I think. Which means that they maybe have a bit of conflict at the gates of Muse, but ultimately they're let in. The guard tries to tell them they can't come in. Victor and or Flick then maybe come to the gate and say, no, look, it's cool, they're with us. And then once we arrive at Muse, what needs to happen eventually, and I think this will be the start of the next episode, is an introduction to Annabelle and Jess, who then gives Ryu and Joey the mission to go off to the Highland border and do the spy thing, which is a very important mission that they get because we have the whole thing with Joey being left behind, Ryu and Nanami waiting for Joey's return, and maybe something that the anime, you know I just went off on a whole thing about how the anime isn't going to want to expand on too much, but an area where I think they could do that is it would be really nice to see a little more about what Joey actually experiences while he's in the Highland camp after Ryu and Nanami leave him there, because he comes back a changed person, as we know, or on his way to becoming a changed person anyway. Which begs the question, how does episode 6 end? Because them just arriving at Muse and Victor and Flick having them be let in through the gates is not an especially satisfying ending. So I think we get another cutaway to Luca to end on an ominous note that lets us know that he's coming for Muse. So they get let in through the gate. Cool, that's the end of their journey for this episode. We then get a cutaway to Luca again in his war camp with his generals. And the last time we had a cutaway like this, later that episode, a village that we had a strong connection to, Toto, got completely burned to the ground and everyone was slaughtered. So we know that these guys mean business and they are dangerous. So we have another meeting with Luca and his generals. We can get a little more insight into the politics of Highland, introduction to people like Seed and Colgan maybe. We don't need detailed introductions of who all the Highland generals are, I don't think, but something to help the viewer recognize the faces of the key players in Luca's kind of tight team of generals. And we should leave that scene with a sense that Muse is Luca's main target, and that's the kind of almost cliffhanger that we leave the episode on. And then, as I mentioned, next time we've got things like the Highland border spy mission for Hiro and Joey. Then after they get back, we've got the hilltop meeting with all that political interest, and then on from there. So that's episode 4, 5, and 6. What do you think? Once again, let me know in the comments if you think I've cut too much, kept too much. How do you think the pacing of the story's going? Let me know, I'm interested. So I'll see you next time for the next episodes.